Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 134 of Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm Lex Starwalker, and on this show, we discuss the craft and art of game mastering. Not only do I pass along any knowledge I've gained over 25 plus years of running RPGs, I also share wisdom from guest GMs and listener GMs like you. I've got a great show for you today. In this episode, I'll discuss a trick I use to help me bring my NPCs to life, or even to create an NPC on the fly during play. I'll also share with you a house rule I've been deliberating for D&D. It's turned out to be a great example of some of the perils of making house rules, and also a great example of why you really want to think about what you're doing before you start fiddling with the game's mechanics. So join me on the journey. Together, we can become game masters, truly worthy of the title. Welcome back to the show, everyone. So good to be back, rocking through December 2016. A little cold out there today. Actually have snow on the ground. So I'm glad I'm in the nice warm studio behind the mic instead of out shoveling snow or something. So at the top of the show today in our announcements, I want to let you know, I'm very excited to tell you that I have set up a voicemail line for the show. I had one of these for GM Intrusions way back in the day. I don't know why it slipped my mind for so long to set one up for this show, but you know, considering how much feedback I bring into the episodes and I bring in as much as I can, and I'd love to bring in more, it behooves us to have a voicemail. So now if you would like to leave a comment for the show or a question or feedback or anything, you can call my voicemail line at 951-GMJ-LEX-1. That's 951-GMJ-LEX, L-E-X, 1. Or 951-465-5391. That's the voicemail. I'll have it in the show notes. If you didn't get that, you can head on over to starwalkerstudios.com and get the information there. And you can call and leave me a message, and it will be really easy for me to just pull that audio directly into the show. So instead of listening to me read an email or read a tweet or a post from Google+, you can hear the question or comment in the person's own voice, which would be pretty cool. And just to remind you, you can always send me sound files to gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can send me a WAV or an MP3, and I can use that on the show as well. But I know a lot of people don't have the capability to record and send in a file like that. But most people have access to a telephone and can make a phone call and leave a voicemail. So definitely feel free to use that. I'm looking forward to getting some voicemails. So something I'm going to start doing now at the top of the show is giving you some highlights from the Game Master's Journey community. You guys hear me talk about the community every episode. We have a community on Google Plus for the show, and it's a meeting of the minds of game masters and RPG players. So we have a lot of great discussions on there, and in recent weeks, the community has been pretty busy, and right now, at the time of recording this, there's a lot of really awesome discussions going on, and I know not all the listeners are part of the community, and probably even people that are in the community don't necessarily keep up on everything that's going on over there. So I thought it would be cool to let you know some of what's going on in the community in case you might want to participate in some of these discussions or just go check them out. So I have links to all of these discussions in the community in the show notes for episode 134 at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. So you can just go there and find the one you want. But here are some of the good things that are going on in the community. And also, many of these, or maybe all of these, will end up being topics that I discuss on the show. So the community is a way for me to get feedback from people on a topic before I even do the episode. So I can bring in ideas from more than just me, or more than just me and a guest I might have on the show. I can bring in your ideas as well. So yeah, these are probably things you'll hear discussed on the show in the future. First one of these definitely will be, and that's on the roles of a GM. So I started a conversation on this in the Google Plus community because I've been wanting for a while to do a series of episodes on the show where I explore the many different hats that we wear as a GM, because one of the most challenging things about becoming a proficient or even excellent game master is that there's so much involved. There are so many different roles that you fill as a game master at different times. And there are so many skill sets that are involved. So I sat down and tried to make a list of what I saw as some of the main roles that a GM fulfills. And then I thought I could do a segment or even an episode on each role, kind of unpacking each and digging into how we can better excel at that particular role. So I put a post about this on the community in the hopes that I'd get some feedback as far as maybe some roles that I haven't thought of or topics that we definitely want to cover within certain roles. And indeed, since I've posted this, I've added 2 new roles to my list that listeners came up with that were really good ideas. And I've also added some notes of things I want to be sure to highlight in certain roles. So right now, the roles I'm looking at that a GM fills are referee. So this is just interpreting and enforcing the rules of the game that you're running and interpreting those rules, things like that. Manager. So I've been a manager in real life, and I've seen a lot of similarities in what you do as a manager as a job and what you do as a game master. So by manager, I'm talking about managing the players and the personalities at the table during a game session. And, that can include everything from handling conflicts between players to, making sure everybody knows where and when the game is and making sure sessions are scheduled, things like that. Just dealing with the players as people around the table, handling any conflicts that develop, handling any issues that you may have with players, whatever those may be, things like that. Another role is world builder. It was a pretty obvious one, but even if you're not running in a setting of your own creation, even if you're running in like a D&D setting or you're running in the Star Wars setting or the Lord of the Rings setting, you're still as a GM most likely doing some world building, because even the most expansive, fleshed out setting isn't going to have everything that you need all the time, and you're going to have to come up with some of your own stuff. So that's a role that we all participate in to some degree. Another role is actor, just role-playing your NPCs and personalities in the world and how to do that effectively. Another role is writer. So writing adventures, writing campaigns, even writing things about your setting for the players, things like that. Writer, I'm kind of looking more at kind of adventure design. Director. So writer is something you're doing between sessions, coming up with stuff. Director is what you're doing during the session. Things like managing the pacing of the game, keeping the game flowing, observing any time constraints you might have, like maybe you only have 4 hours for your session, things like that. So there's a lot of similarities, I think, between the GM when she's actually running a game and a director for a movie or a TV show. Storyteller is another one. So the writer is the GM creating things in between sessions to use during sessions. The storyteller is the GM during the session telling a story, and how do you get your story across, and how do you pull in what the players are doing and any subplots that arise, how do you pull those into your story and make everything that happens in a session work together to tell a cohesive story. Improviser is another role that we often fill as a GM. Sometimes you just got to come up with stuff on the fly. You can't always be prepared for everything ahead of time. And being a GM takes a lot of improvisational skills. So that's definitely a role we can unpack. And here are a couple that listeners in the community came up with that I've added to the list that are great suggestions. One is psychologist. This is a great idea, but it's very true that as a GM, we're often using psychology in various ways, whether it's to try to steer the player characters in a certain direction or to try to have a mystery for the player characters to solve. Things like that. There's a lot of times that we're using psychology to either kind of shine a light on something we want the players to notice or to try to obfuscate something that we don't want the players to notice. An example of this is I was running D&D recently, and I was running in a dungeon I've been creating, and I put a stairway in the dungeon that goes down to a lower level. But I haven't really done a whole lot in fleshing out that level. I for instance, don't have a nice map, like finalized map for it yet. And I'm running the game, and I didn't expect this to happen, but it happened that the player characters found the staircase to the lower level. And I kind of had this oh shit moment of crap. I hope they don't decide to go down the stairs, because then I'm going to have to totally wing it, which is fine. But they're going to know I'm winging it because I'm not going to have a map to show them. So on the fly, I just decided to try to dissuade them from going down the stairs. And the way I did it was very simple. This facility that they've been in is lit. There are magic ever-burning torches on the walls, and every room that they've been in has been lit in this way. And they've had some pretty hairy encounters. So I told them that this stairway goes down into darkness, and kind of just tried to use the psychology of darkness being scary and evil things tend to hide in the darkness to try to convey, things might be a little more dangerous down there. Maybe we want to hold off on that. And it actually worked. I was afraid to do anything more than that because I didn't want to just come out and say, hey guys, don't go down there. I'm not ready yet. Because that would break the fourth wall a little bit more than I would want to. So I was hoping that just by making it seem a little dark and foreboding that they would decide, hey, let's hold off on that. And luckily they did. So that was, a way to kind of use psychology to direct the players the way I wanted to go without it hopefully seeming completely obvious that that's what I was doing. And, that's kind of the point of the psychology thing, because I could see people kind of getting concerned about that. Like, oh, are we doing psychological warfare on the players, or are we trying to manipulate them? And it's like, well, yeah, you're trying to manipulate them, but it's not, in a malicious way. It's really to try to preserve suspension of disbelief and try to keep that fourth wall there, so that it seems more like a story that we're experiencing together and less like a game. Or at least that's how I use it. And then finally, my last role that I have that I want to discuss is the GM as teacher. And this was another idea presented by a listener. That's a fantastic idea, and very much has been my experience. I often find myself teaching players how to play the particular game that we're playing, and even how to play an RPG in general. I've had many players at my tables that this is the first time they've ever played an RPG. And I think that's true for a lot of us. And at the very least, even if you're not dealing with players who've never played an RPG before, a lot of times as GMs, we're introducing players to a new game that they haven't played before, or a new edition of a game that they haven't played before. So teaching the mechanics of the game and teaching the rules of the game, and also just teaching how RPGs work in general, is often something that we find ourselves doing as GMs. So if you have any thoughts about any of those roles, points that you think I should definitely make in discussing those particular roles, or if you have ideas for other, big roles that GMs do that are worth discussing, then definitely follow the link at the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com to this discussion on the community, and weigh in. And the more ideas and thoughts we get on this, the better these series of segments or episodes will be. I also have a post in the community where I'm requesting feedback on the show. This is just kind of an end of the year thing as we're wrapping up season 7, heading towards season 8 of the show. You know, it's just a time to evaluate the show. What's working? What isn't working? Are there any changes I want to make? So if you have any thoughts or opinions about the show, that's a great place to let me know. And quite a few listeners already have. And of course, I'll have that linked in the show notes as well. We also just recently had a discussion start on using riddles and puzzles and things like that in your games. And how can we pull that off? Because it's often a very difficult thing to do. And I myself, I think, have had more failures in trying to use riddles and riddles and puzzles and things like that in the game. I think I've failed more often than succeeded at that kind of thing. It's definitely a tricky thing to do, definitely something I'd consider an advanced technique. And really interesting discussion is going on about that. And that is something I'd love to do an episode on in the future. But I'm going to need a lot of advice or ideas from other people because, again, I don't feel that this is something that I've mastered myself. We have another discussion on, well, actually probably a few discussions on the latest Unearthed Arcanas that have been released by Wizards for D&D that are giving new archetypes for the various classes. They're going through the classes in alphabetical order. As of recording this week, they just put out the one for the monk. And we've had quite a few discussions about what we think of these and where they seem to be going and some of the problems we see in how they seem to be approaching these and whether they're really giving us what we want in more player options or whether they're kind of missing the mark there. So that's been some really interesting discussion. Also have a discussion on calendars in your game setting. You know, do you develop your own calendar for your world? And if so, how do you do that? And how do you handle that with your players? How do you educate your players about how your calendar works if you have a calendar? Another topic that's being discussed is building encounters. And this is one of those evergreen topics that just come up over and over again. It's one of the more challenging things that we do as GMs is building encounters and then putting those encounters together into some kind of cohesive session or adventure or story or a campaign. And so we've got a great discussion on that. And that is a topic I'm sure will be covered again and again on the show because there is always more to say on building encounters. And then finally, I did put up a new poll for the community. And this new poll is, what is your favorite, quote, arcane class in 5th edition? And granted, we don't really have arcane versus divine classes anymore. That isn't really a thing in 5th edition anymore. But comparing the classes of the wizard, warlock, sorcerer, bard, what's your favorite and why? And so that's been running for a few days. Maybe next week I'll discuss the results of that with you. I've noticed I talk about these polls on the show, and I'll often have a link to the poll in the show notes, and I'll get a bunch of new votes after the episode where I shared the results of the poll, in which case it's kind of too late to discuss those new votes on the show. So I thought this time I would discuss the poll before I discuss it on the show. So those of you listening can head to the show notes and go take that poll so that your vote can be part of the discussion as far as what the results of this poll are. So again, I will have links to all these topics and discussions in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. So you can just head there and find everything you need there.
This is Shane from the Total Party Thrill podcast, and you're listening to Lex Starwalker on Game Master's Journey.
I want to give a quick shout out to the patrons of Starwalker Studios. The support of the patrons makes this show possible. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to give a little back, becoming a patron is a great way to do so. Patrons get some cool perks like game material I make for Primordia and access to a special monthly podcast I produce just for the patrons. I'd also like to give a huge shout out and thank you to my Tier 4 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's hear it for Steve.
Yeah.
Yes.
You the man.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all the patrons. You can find out more about becoming a patron by clicking on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. For our first topic today, I thought I would talk just a little bit about running NPCs at the table as a GM. And I'll tell you, I am not the master at this. Believe me, I can't do cool voices or accents. I'm not an actor or anything like that. So, definitely if you're someone watching like Critical Role and you're thinking, oh, this is what I need to be able to do to role play NPCs effectively as a game master. I mean, obviously, if you can do voices and accents, that will definitely enhance things as long as you don't overdo it and you do it well. But you don't have to be able to do those things to be a good GM and to be able to have NPCs that the players kind of latch onto and enjoy, or at least I don't think you do. I hope you don't. Otherwise, most of us are doomed. So I don't think that's required. And in fact, thinking back, I've maybe had one or two GMs in my life that I played under that could do that kind of thing. Most of them couldn't. And I never found myself thinking, oh, I wish this dwarf could have a Scottish accent. So, I think it's nice if you can do it, but if you can't, it's not necessary. So as game masters, we constantly need more NPCs, right? You can never have too many NPCs. And not only are there all of the NPCs that we create that we plan to use during a given adventure or a given game session, but there's also all the NPCs that come up during gameplay just based on things that the players decide to do. So maybe they decide to go into a store that you never planned on them going into. Well, now you need NPCs for the people in the store, the shopkeeper and other customers in the store and things like that. Or maybe one of the player characters wants to go to a blacksmith and you didn't anticipate that. So now you got to come up with this blacksmith and maybe some of his apprentices on the fly, right? So there's always characters that as game masters, we kind of have to just pull out of our ass at a moment's notice that we didn't plan for. So, the example of a player decides to go buy a suit of armor. I mean, yeah, you could just hand wave that and move on, or just say you find a suit of armor and this is what it costs. Or you could role play it and build a scene around the player character finding a blacksmith and hiring him to craft him a suit of armor, or maybe he's got one that he can fit to the character or whatever. You could build a scene around it and role play it. And, you always have to decide as a GM which route to take. And I wouldn't say to always do it the same way. Don't always role play every single purchase that a player character wants to make. But at the same time, you don't want to never role play that either, because you might wonder, well, who cares about shopping? If the player wants to buy a weapon or something, let's just handle the paperwork part of it of, what does it cost? And let's move on to something more interesting. I don't care about that. And, that may be true. And depending on the kind of story you're running, that may be the way to go. But those things can often be opportunities to enrich your story, or maybe if the player characters have gotten off track, to get them back on track, or to introduce a side plot or something like that. Anytime a character is going to interact with an NPC, as a GM, you have an opportunity there to kind of do whatever you want. You can come up with any kind of NPC that you want, and you can have that NPC fulfill any kind of function in your game that you want, whether it's to point the player characters back towards the quest that they're on, or to let them know about a side quest they could go on, or let them know about a mystery they could explore, or things like that. You know, NPCs are great sources of rumor, of things that may or may not be going on, of gossip about other characters in the area, adventure hooks, all that kind of stuff. So, you know, you could take just a player character wanting to buy a suit of armor, and instead of just hand waving that, you could create a scene around it, and in that scene accomplish something that you need to accomplish for the story to move things forward, whatever that may be. So in this example, you could come up with a blacksmith NPC. Maybe he has an assistant or an apprentice that you could come up with a character for that too. And both of these could be very engaging NPCs that have their own personalities and their own ways of thinking and doing things, even though you just came up with it on the spot. And I have a little trick I use, and I know a lot of game masters use this trick to help me do that. So coming up with a good NPC on the fly without any time to really think about it can be really challenging. And it can be especially challenging to make one of these off-the-cuff characters that you create interesting and unique. You know, each of us as individuals have our own tendencies. We have our own preferences. We have our own sources of inspiration. And one way of saying it is we have our own wells, our own creative wells of inspiration that we tend to go back to over and over when we need an idea right now. And if you pay attention to yourself and things that you come up with, and especially things that you come up with like at the drop of a hat during a game session where you have to come up with an NPC, or you have to come up with a location or a magic item or whatever, and you have to do it like on the fly. You didn't expect this. You didn't see this coming. If you pay attention to the things you come up with, you'll often be able to identify, you know, those wells for yourself. Like, oh, when I'm stuck, I tend to get ideas from Star Wars, or I tend to get ideas from the Song of Ice and Fire's novels, or the Lord of the Rings books, or whatever. You know, we all have our kind of go-to sources for inspiration and ideas. So that's fine, and that's all well and good. The only problem can be when you're having to come up with stuff on the fly fairly often, and you're always going back to these same wells for your ideas. Things can start to seem kind of samey. You know, for instance, as an example, you know, talking about coming up with NPCs, that's kind of what we're talking about here specifically. So maybe this isn't true, but maybe I'm really good at doing a Scottish accent. So maybe not only do all the dwarves in my world tend to have Scottish accents, but maybe all the NPCs in general do, because anytime I come up with an NPC on the fly, I tend to give them a Scottish accent, not necessarily because there's any story reason that makes sense, but because I'm good at doing a Scottish accent. It's the thing I can do, and I feel like that will make the NPC more engaging or whatever. So eventually the players start to notice, hey, every time we meet a new NPC, they tend to have a Scottish accent. That's kind of weird, especially since they're not even all dwarves or whatever. So, you know, that's an example of how, you know, me coming up with things on the fly a lot and always kind of going to those same sources of inspiration, all my NPCs start to feel the same. And that's something you want to avoid if you can. But then how do you do that when you have to come up with something like on the spot? So here's the trick I use a lot of times to do this. And I use this not only to come up with an NPC on the fly quickly, but also I often use it to help me flesh out and role play an NPC even when I've come up with ahead of time. So what I do is I either will base the NPC on a specific character. So I guess there's two methods here. So let's talk about that one first. I'll just base the NPC on a character from a story that I like. And this is a great thing to do, you know, when you're coming up with something on the fly, because, you know, instead of trying to sit here and come up with a laundry list of character traits, you can instead think of a specific character and boom, you've got your laundry list right there. So maybe I might base a character on Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones, or Dolores from Westworld, or Han Solo from Star Wars. So, I PC goes to the blacksmith on the fly. I didn't expect this. I need a blacksmith right away. So maybe I decide, this blacksmith is based on Jaime Lannister. All right. So I could use that to inform what the blacksmith looks like, how the blacksmith is dressed, how the blacksmith talks, what the blacksmith's personality is like, what their motives are, what their goals are. I could base as many or as few of those things as I want on Jaime Lannister. Now, there's a few obvious things, you want to be cautious of with this method. First of all, it's best if you can find something a little obscure. Jaime Lannister actually probably wouldn't be the greatest choice because that character is very much in our public consciousness right now. And there's a good chance that a player character might suss out that this is Jaime Lannister, or Han Solo would also be another one that might be too well known, too much of a household name kind of character to use, especially if you're going to take the character whole cloth and not just take a few elements. So, if you can think of a character from a story that you like, that is maybe a story that's, an older story, like a fantasy novel from a few years ago that not everybody's talking about right now, or maybe is not one of the main characters, but is one of the side characters or something like that. So especially if the character is a very well-known character like Han Solo, I would recommend not entirely basing the character, your NPC, on that character, just to avoid the possibility of the players realizing who this character is based off of, which if they do that, it's going to kick them out of the story. It's going to spoil their suspension of disbelief. And it's just not going to be as cool if they figure out what your inspiration is. So one way to avoid that, especially if you are using a character that is pretty well known, is instead of making this a carbon copy of the character, instead choose a few elements from that character that you especially like and you think fit the situation and run with those, base your character on those, but don't necessarily make it Han Solo in every way. Maybe you make the character kind of roguish like Han Solo and kind of have this kind of self-interest like Han Solo, but maybe in other ways he's different. So that's the first method. Just think of a character from a book or a TV show or a movie that you think would work well in the situation, and either base your NPC entirely on that character, which can work if it's a character that your players aren't going to be familiar with or aren't going to make a connection with, or you can just use that character as inspiration, take a few traits from that character and use that as your foundation to kind of on the fly build your NPC. Now, the second trick I use, which is kind of just a different version of the same trick, and this is one I use not only on the fly during play, but I also often use this in preparation when I'm creating NPCs beforehand. And that's instead of just basing your character on a character from a movie, instead ask yourself, if this NPC I'm creating were a character in the movie, like let's say we're making a movie of my game, who would play that character? And this is really useful to help you flesh out an NPC that you already have something for. I use this personally to help me with an NPC's personality and to help me maybe with what that NPC looks like, how they present themselves, things like that. So I might have a character that I've developed for my story, and then I'll ask myself, okay, who would play this character? And I could say an actor. I could say Harrison Ford plays this character. So that tells me what the character may look like, maybe helps me role play that character, because maybe I can channel Harrison Ford a little bit while I role play this character with my very limited acting ability. And we'll at least, even if I can't pull off Harrison Ford, we'll at least give this character a different feel than the last character that I played. Or you could go a step further and say this NPC is played by Harrison Ford as Han Solo. So not just Harrison Ford in general, but Harrison Ford's performance as Han Solo. That's informing this character's way of speaking, any kind of mannerisms the character might have, things like that. So, again, this can work both on the fly during play and for game prep. So on the fly, maybe you have a few ideas for the blacksmith, but you're just not sure how to play the character as far as personality. Well, ask yourself, who do I see playing this part? If this were a TV show or a movie, who would play the blacksmith? And if you decide Will Smith is going to play my blacksmith, well, now you've got some ideas of what the blacksmith might look like, or how the blacksmith might talk, what kind of sense of humor the blacksmith has, things like that. Or you could say Will Smith, his character in Men in Black, which is a more specific, right? Because Will Smith has played different characters. So that kind of thing. So that can help you on the fly just to kind of pull a personality out of the air and even a physical description when you need it. But again, you can also use it during prep to kind of help flesh out an NPC and make it more like a real person with maybe some quirks, some personality attributes, maybe how they talk, their vocabulary, things like that. And it's a lot easier, I think, to think of someone and replicate how they talk than it is to just fabricate a way of talking out of nothing. You know what I mean? For me, that seems a lot easier. So that can help you, with a character you're building, kind of flesh out their personality. Can even help you with their physical description. If you're kind of stumped on what they might look like, think again, who would play this character, and then describe the character based on that. So you can use this, who's playing the character to help you, more role play them more believably and make more of a distinction between your various NPCs, especially if you do this with every NPC you play at the table. If you think of, like, you've basically cast all your NPCs. So when you play a particular NPC, you can think of that actor or that actor's particular performance that you're using as inspiration for this NPC. And I think if you try to replicate that in your role playing, even if you're like me and you don't have any acting ability or training or anything like that, I think that you're going to accomplish more diversity in your NPCs if you're basing each one on a different person that you've been exposed to and trying to talk how that person talks, right? So even if you can't do accents, you can do things like, well, maybe this particular person uses really big words. Maybe this person uses a lot of profanity. Maybe this person uses certain turns of phrases that you don't hear a lot, but this person uses them a lot. Things like that. Even their cadence of their speech. Maybe this person speaks really slowly, or maybe they speak really quickly. Maybe they have long pauses in the middle of their thoughts. Things like that. Also, this could include mannerisms, like the character strokes his beard a lot, or scratches his ear, or squints, or anything like that. So I found, at least for me personally, it can be a lot easier to come up with a whole suite of things like that to flesh out an NPC. If I think of either a character to base that NPC on, or I think of casting that character with an actor that I'm familiar with and think, how would this actor play this role? And then use that to inform my own role playing. Anyway, that's what works for me, and it doesn't take a lot of processing power, and it's something that you can do on the fly. So if you're not already doing this, I think a lot of GMs do this. It seems like kind of a natural thing, but I've learned on this show that sometimes things that seem obvious to me aren't necessarily obvious to everyone. So if you've never tried it, give it a shot and let me know how it goes. My favorite part of the show is when I hear from listener GMs like you. If you have feedback for the show, whether it's a comment on today's topic or an idea for a future topic, I'd love to hear from you. There are a lot of great ways to get a hold of me. You can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com, follow me on Twitter @LexStarWalker, Google Plus LexStarWalker, and finally, you can visit the website starwalkerstudios.com to get links to my Patreon page, YouTube channel, and more. So it turns out I've been using a house rule when I run D&D 5th edition that I wasn't even sure was a house rule. I wasn't sure if I was using the rules as written or the rules as intended, or if indeed I was doing my own house rule. And I was curious as to which of those it was. So I actually tweeted at Jeremy Crawford on Twitter and asked him, and had a short but very illuminating discussion with him on Twitter about it. And turns out it is indeed a house rule. So I thought that this might be enlightening to discuss in order to kind of show some of the perils of making house rules, and how, you want to be careful when you make house rules, because they can often have impacts beyond what are obvious and what you're really thinking of at the time. So what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about specifically how I handle the use of potions in combat in D&D. And I base this position on a couple passages from the Player's Handbook. So these both come from page 190 of the Player's Handbook, where we're talking about free interactions with objects during your round. So during a combat round, you're allowed to interact with one object or feature of the environment for free during either your move or your action. Now, the most common use of this is drawing a weapon. So we probably all know, those of us that play 5th edition, that as part of your move or your action, you can draw one weapon for free. Basically, it doesn't take an action or whatever to pull out that one weapon. But there are other things you can do with that free interaction with an object or an environment during your turn, something like open a door or something like that. And there's a sidebar on page 190 of the Player's Handbook that lists some examples of things you can do with that free interaction. So 2 of those listed examples, which are relevant to what we're discussing today, were first, you can withdraw a potion from your backpack. So during a combat round, as part of your move or your action, you can pull out a potion that you have in your backpack, and it doesn't cost you an action or a bonus action or a reaction or anything like that to do so. It's free. Another one of these examples of something that you can do for free during your turn is drink all the ale in a flagon. Now, I approached this from just a completely just kind of logical, real world understanding of physics and what's possible perspective. And I thought, well, if you're telling me that let's just call it a free action. That's not what they call it, but let's call it a free action. As a free action in a turn, I can drink a whole flagon of ale. Then I think it stands to reason that as a free action in a turn, I could drink a potion, like a potion of cure wounds or a potion of healing, I guess is what we call it now. Usually, when potions are illustrated, they're pretty small. They can be anything from an ounce to maybe 4 ounces in size. Definitely smaller usually than a flagon of ale. Ale is also usually carbonated, which makes it a little harder to toss back. You can chug something that's non-carbonated usually more quickly, or at least more comfortably than something that is carbonated. So with all those things, bearing in mind, I was like, well, surely if I can chug a whole flagon of ale and that doesn't count as an action, then I could drink a potion, and that shouldn't count as an action either. So assuming that to be true, there's some possible permutations of this. So basically, without using an action or anything like that, you can either take out a potion that you have stowed away, or you could drink a potion that you already have in hand. So one permutation of that is on round 1 of a combat, you could, without using an action as your free interaction with an object for the round, you could pull a potion out of your backpack. Then on round 2, you could, as a free action, without using an action, just with your free interaction with an object, you could then drink that potion that you now have in hand. So over the course of 2 rounds of combat, you've taken out a potion and you've drank it, all while in both of those rounds being able to still have your action and your reaction and your bonus action and your full movement. I think that's kind of cool. It's like, yeah, it takes 2 rounds to do, but you can manage to use a potion basically for free in combat if you're willing to take 2 rounds to do it, and if you have a free hand. Obviously, if you're using a shield, or if you're fighting with 2 weapons, or you're using a 2-handed weapon, this isn't going to work, right? Because you can't attack with a 2-handed weapon if you're holding a potion in one of your hands. So that's one permutation of this. Second permutation, you could, on round 1 of the combat, pull out the potion from your backpack as a free interaction, as a free action, and then use your action to drink it. So now you've gotten your healing or your buff or whatever you want from your potion in that first round. And you still have your movement, you still have your bonus action, and you still have your reaction. Third permutation, let's say you began combat and you already had the potion in hand. You could then in that first round of combat, drink that potion as your free interaction, as your free action, and still get your attack, still get your action, bonus action, reaction, and full movement. I thought that was pretty cool. And, going by these passages, I thought this was the rules as written. Wasn't sure if these were the rules as intended, if only because I haven't seen anybody else doing this. I see a lot of actual play online. I've seen Chris Perkins run games. I've seen other people from Wizards run games. I can't remember who now. And I've never seen anybody do this. I've never seen another DM do this. So that makes me think that it's probably not rules as intended, because if it were, other people would be doing it. But it does seem to be rules as written. So I shared all this with Jeremy Crawford and I said, hey, is this rules as written, rules as intended, or am I house ruling this? So Jeremy was kind enough to respond to me, and he said the rule for drinking a potion is in the section on potions in the Dungeon Master's Guide, page 139. And that rule simply states that drinking a potion takes an action. So, well, first of all, that answered my question, right? So this is a house rule. This isn't the rules as written, because that rule about drinking a flagon of ale is ale, not a potion. And there's a separate rule that covers potions, which says drinking a potion is an action. So it's not rules as written, and it's not rules as intended. It's a house rule. This is something I've changed the rules by doing it this way. So I said to Jeremy, I said, well, other than balance reasons, I can't imagine why drinking a potion would take more time than drinking a flagon of ale, which I already shared that reasoning with you. To which he said, it's absolutely a game rule. It's not meant to simulate the rates of liquid consumption. I gotcha. That makes total sense. Kind of like the game rule that you can pour a healing potion down the throat of someone who's unconscious and heal them, which again takes an action to do that. In real life, that person would asphyxiate and choke to death if you tried to pour something down the throat of someone who's unconscious. That's what would happen. But again, this is a game. We're not simulating reality. This isn't a physics simulation or a biology simulation. It's a game. And also it's magic. So you can do that. So I'm okay with that. And Jeremy says, indeed, D&D is not a physics engine. So then I responded, okay, all that said, do you think that allowing this increased use of potion use would cause any balance problems? Because I'm thinking it won't, because for the most part, potions aren't super powerful. And the other thing, and kind of why I even do this way to begin with, other than I found this in the rules and I thought this was actually the way it was supposed to work. But the other reason is I don't see players using potions a lot during combat. And I think as DMs, a lot of times we see characters that get to high level have, in their bag of holding, have all these potions that they got like 10 levels ago that they never used. I know we saw that a lot in 3rd edition. I haven't played 5th edition enough yet at high levels to see if that still holds true. But that was a big thing in 3rd edition. You'd have all these consumable magic items from low levels that you still have at high level because you never used them. And I thought, well, if I can use this rule to kind of amp up potion use in combat a little bit, then it will encourage players to use them more. The other thing I was thinking is that a lot of times in groups I run, there's not someone that's a super good healer. And I thought that would make healing potions a little bit more useful during combat. I would still say that administering a potion to someone else is an action. I would not let that happen as a free action. But drinking a potion yourself that you already have in hand, I'd be okay with that being a free action. And, it makes healing during combat a little bit easier if you don't have an actual healer. So I thought those were a couple good reasons to use this, even if it was a house rule. But I was really curious what Jeremy would think as far as what impact this would have on the balance of the game, because as lead designer of the game and the rules guru, the sage, who would know better than him what impact this might have? And his response to my question was really interesting. He says, potions are effectively bottled spells. Do you want spells cast as non-actions in your game? Right? I love this for a few reasons. First of all, he didn't say what I should do. Right? And that's one thing I really like about Wizards with 5th edition is, I follow all the big cheeses on Twitter, Mike Merles, Chris Perkins, Jeremy Crawford, and, to a man, they consistently hold with, it's the DM's call, it's the DM's call, it's the DM's call, it's the DM's call, which I love. I love that we've gone back to that, it's up to the DM, if he's going to allow this or not. So I really like that he didn't just say, no, you shouldn't do it, or yes, you should do it. Instead, he said, well, here's what you should think about. The fact that potions are really just a spell in a bottle. And are you comfortable as the DM with saying that you can basically, by using a potion, you can cast a spell during combat without using any kind of an action to do so? And it's funny because that's the first time I've had pause with this house rule. Now, part of that might be because up until today, I didn't think it was actually a house rule, or I wasn't sure if it was. I thought it might be at least rules as written, if not as intended. But this gave me pause because I'm like, if instead of a potion, this were a magic missile spell, no, I wouldn't be cool with it. I wouldn't be cool with giving a player character the ability to cast magic missile without having to use at least a bonus action or a reaction or something, right? Or some movement or something. They got to use something to do it. They can't just do it for free. But that's effectively what I'm doing with potions. And I'm thinking, well, it'll be okay. First of all, because potions tend not to be very powerful anyway. And I most see this being used with healing potions. But it's like, well, what if the PCs have potions of cloud giant strength and they're drinking those as free actions during combat? How would I feel about that? Or, I'm not super well versed on potions in 5e to know what some of the more powerful ones, like maybe Potion of Heroism, right? Maybe that's probably a bit much to have that done as a free action during combat. So, it really made me think, and it really, I haven't made a decision yet. I literally just had this conversation with him a couple hours ago. So I'm going to give myself time to kind of mull it over. But, if you force me to make a decision right now, I would probably say what I usually say, which is I'm just going with the rules as written and as intended, because, these guys are pros and this has been play tested, and I'll take their word that it's probably not wise to let people use potions as free actions during combat. But since I'm not forced to make the decision right now, I can think about it myself and see what I think about it and maybe play test it. This is a rule that I've used for quite a while in my own games. But that said, I'm not even sure if a PC has ever used it, maybe once or twice. It's definitely not been something that has been abused at my table, because one thing I always think about when it comes to house rules, and, that's what this is really about on the podcast today, is I want to talk about, how to think about house rules that you're thinking about implementing and how they can have consequences that you don't think of that don't really have anything to do with what you're thinking of, right? So this whole thing with potions, I was thinking of what are a way I can make potions more attractive to use during combat because I don't see players using them. What are ways that I can make potions maybe a little bit better for using as healing during combat, because a lot of times my groups don't have healers. I wasn't really so much thinking about, well, how could player characters abuse this? And that's something anytime you come up with any house rule, before you come to the players with it and say, this is a thing in my game now, you want to think about how could players abuse this? Because you will eventually have a player that will try to abuse anything you come up with. I mean, we're gamers. It's kind of part of the gamer mentality is trying to find loopholes, trying to find exploits, right? It's just a lot of us do it without even thinking. So eventually you'll have a player abuse a house rule if it can be abused. So, let's think about this with potions. How could a player abuse this? Well, the obvious answer to that is, well, if you have players who figure out that, hey, this is actually kind of powerful and is actually kind of beyond the scope of what's intended in the game, I can effectively cast a spell for free during combat. Well, the first thing that player is going to do is they're going to go to the Dungeon Master Guide and they're going to look through the potions and they're going to look at what are the most powerful potions available to me and how much of a leg up would that give me if I could have that potion and use it as a free action during combat. So let's do that real quick. Let's do it. All right. So unfortunately, we don't have a chart of potions by rarity in the DMG. Although you kind of have the equivalent if you go to the tables where you roll magic items, Let's see what we got here. We've got a couple tables that have consumables. So table C, we've got some higher level consumables. Table D, even higher. Table E, highest yet. And that looks like the highest. So let's look at table E here. We've got Potion of Storm Giant Strength, Potion of Supreme Healing, Universal Solvent, and Sovereign Glue. So let's look at Potion of Storm Giant Strength. Potion of Storm Giant Strength gives you a 29 strength. That's a legendary potion. So do I think having my player characters all be able to have a 29 strength as a free action during combat, could that be abused? Probably. I'd be more worried if it were dexterity, frankly, than strength. I don't see a lot of PCs relying on strength in 5th edition. You know, dexterity is definitely the overpowered stat if there is one. So if there were a potion that gave you 29 dexterity, yeah, I definitely would not want to see that used as a free action during combat. But even the strength, if I've got like a barbarian or a cleric PC that relies on strength, you know, that's a pretty big leg up to attack bonus and damage rolls as a free action that would last the entire combat with no need for concentration. That's probably a little overpowered. That could probably be abused. Potion of Gaseous Form is a rare. Yeah, probably not cool people turning into gaseous form as a free action. And again, you know, when you're wondering how this could be abused, you got to think of the worst case scenario, right? Worst case scenario is the whole party loads up with this thing, these things, right? So every PC has a Potion of Storm Giant Strength and a Potion of Gaseous Form and a Potion of Superior Healing, and they're all using those during rounds as free actions. Like, that would get pretty crazy quick, right? And before you say, "Oh, Lex, that would never happen," it would, and it will. And probably most more experienced DMs are probably nodding their heads like, yeah, I could totally see player characters doing that. And even going further, right? Coming up with some kind of item that they craft like a potion bandolier so that it no longer even takes that free interaction with an object to get the potion into their hand during combat, right? So now they can do a potion every round as a free action instead of every other round. And, you know, I could see players catching an unwary GM with that. Like, "Hey, GM," you know, all innocent, like, "Hey, GM, you know, could I make this bandolier to hold potions?" And then that way it doesn't take my interaction with an object to get a potion out during combat. And if the GM is not paying attention and not thinking of how this could be abused, might be like, "Yeah, that doesn't seem too unreasonable." Until you realize that you've effectively given them the ability to drink potions every round of combat as a free action, that's probably not good. So yeah. So you see here, actually in the course of this discussion on the podcast, I've gone from, I don't think this would be a problem and I'd probably be fine using it, to this probably can and will be abused, and I probably don't want to use it. Just by looking at some example potions, some of the more powerful potions in the game, and imagining that worst case scenario, all the player characters have them. They've, you know, maybe they've all got 3 Storm Giant potions or whatever, you know. What would a combat look like if they're all just tossing these back as free actions every round? It'd be pretty fucking ridiculous. So once again, showing that this game is very well designed. And usually when you try to do something broken, the designers saw you coming. So in this case, they saw us coming because they said, yeah, you can drink a flagon of ale as a free interaction with the environment or an object in your turn. But drinking a potion, because it's magical and it has an impact on combat and it's going to give you some kind of bonus or something, that is an action, my friend. Even though logically, physically, biologically, it doesn't make sense that you could drink a whole flagon of ale, you know, and it's super easy, but a potion isn't. But from a game balance and a mechanics point of view, I think you can see why it's got to be that way. Because, you know, having player characters slugging down beer while they're fighting isn't going to break the game or even affect the game in any way, other that hilarity will likely ensue. But those same player characters tossing down potions left and right during combat without having to use any actions, that would probably have an impact on the game. I don't know if it'd break your game, probably not, but it could ruin some encounters for you. And, you know, if it's something that's like the player character's MO now, it's like something that you would have to plan around. It's like, okay, anytime I come up with an encounter, I can bet they're going to be drinking, potions of cure serious wounds as free actions and drinking potions of storm giant strength as free action. So I got to kind of plan for that. Got to kind of figure that into their how much damage they can do and how much damage they can take when I'm figuring out what's an appropriate encounter. And, just one other side of this, you probably know from listening to the show, I'm not the kind of GM who believes in only throwing, quote, appropriate encounters at my PCs. I have no problem with having them come across something that could just wipe the floor with them if they're not stupid or they're not smart enough to run away. And I'm perfectly fine with throwing something at them that's actually no threat at all that they can just mow through. To me, that adds to the realism of the game. I don't want my D&D game to feel like we're playing an MMO and it's like, oh, this is the level 1 to 5 zone. And now that we're level 6, we're going to go to the level 6 to 10 zone where all the creatures are CR 6 to 10. That's like so stupid and contrived. And I've played in games like that. I've run games like that. And it gets way too gamey. The players will figure that out and they'll count on it. And you get to this like metagaming that isn't good for your game, isn't good for your campaign, where it's like, maybe they encounter, I don't know, some giants or something and they're losing and they should probably run away. But the players are like, oh, well, Lex wouldn't put this encounter here unless we could take it because we're in the level 6 to 10 zone right now. So this must be a level 6 to 10 encounter. It should con, at worst orange to us. It can't be red. Sorry for all the MMO references for people that don't know what I'm talking about. But the point is they're thinking about the game as mechanics and they're not thinking what would their character do. The character would get the fuck out of there and get away because obviously things are going south. But the players are like, oh, well, it's an appropriate encounter. We can pull this out. We can win. And maybe they all get killed. Or maybe they don't. But the thing is like, that's not where you want the players' heads at in that situation. You want them thinking, what would my character do? What is my character feeling right now? What is my character thinking right now? How am I going to react to this? Not, well, I know this must be between CR 6 and 10, so we should be able to take it. So we're going to keep fighting. That's not role playing. I don't know what that is, but that's not role playing. That's not what I signed up for. It's probably not what you signed up for either. It's probably not what the players signed up for. And they're going to get bored with that kind of thing because they're never really going to be challenged. Their characters aren't going to be challenged as far as their abilities if everything's, quote, appropriate for their level. And the players aren't going to be challenged mentally because they can just check out. They don't have to worry about assessing, is this something we can handle or not? Is this something we should run away from at the very beginning because we may not be able to get away to begin with and we definitely can't take it? Or is this something where we can fight it for a few rounds, see how it goes, and then maybe run away then if we need to? I want players to have to figure that out. And I want them to do it through role playing and through the information I'm giving them as a GM as far as what they're sensing and what they're can figure out from what's going on, as opposed to, oh, we're in a level 6 zone, so I know this is a CR 6 creature, so we should be able to take it. Like, I don't want that in my game. And finally, that brings in more tension and suspense, right? If I'm playing a level 6 character and I know I'm in a CR 6 zone and I'm never going to encounter anything other than, or higher than CR 6, then I'm not too worried. But if this is a more realistic representation of a world and a CR 27 dragon could just fly over because it wants to, and if it notices me, could wipe me and the party out in a single round. So maybe we better hide under a rock and pray to God it doesn't see us. That's a lot more pucker factor. I'm going to be a lot more careful and cautious and paying a lot more attention to the little bits of information the GM hands out. And I'm going to be a lot more tense and I'm going to be a lot more engaged because there's real danger there, or there could be. The point is, I don't know. And that uncertainty and that feeling of anything could happen. We could turn the corner and there could be anything there from CR 1/8 to CR 30. We don't know. There is no such thing as a CR 5 zone. I just think it makes the game a lot more fun. So yeah, bringing it back to the whole, house ruling thing, I hope that this shows you how something that seems innocuous, that seems like it's not a big deal, like letting you drink a potion as a free action, like at first glance, it doesn't seem like a big deal. It doesn't seem like that could possibly break the game or even matter. Like it might even seem like it's not even enough of a boost to even worry about telling the player characters that they can do this, because it's like, well, so what? Like, is a potion of healing really going to make that big of a difference? It's like, well, a potion of superior healing might, So I hope, this kind of shows how you can make a house rule and it can seem minor and it can seem like it's not a big deal. And it might work great for what you're trying to do with that house rule. But you got to think about, well, what are other possible consequences? How is this going to interact with other aspects of the system? And also, how could this be abused, right? How could a crafty, intelligent, cunning player take this house rule and abuse it and take that to the utmost, like dial it up to 11. Imagine you have the most evil player in the world and they're going to just abuse the shit out of this house rule. What would that player do? And then think about, if a player actually did that, how would you feel about it? And if you're like, I wouldn't care, it's not a big deal, then, that might be a house rule that's pretty safe to make and you can handle the consequences. But if, like with this potion thing, you start thinking about it and you're like, actually, if a player really wanted to abuse this, it could get pretty bad and it could really throw a wrench, not only in a single encounter, but in every future encounter. If this becomes a go-to strategy for the players, then you might end up thinking, you know what, this house rule isn't worth the trouble. I'm going to run the game as written. And I want to tell you, when I first started running D&D in the 2nd edition days, up through 3rd edition, even 3.5, I made a lot of house rules. A lot, especially in 2nd edition. Oh my God. I think I had more house rules than actual rules of the game that I used. For instance, one of my house rules in 2nd edition was limitless cantrips, which we finally saw in, I think, 3rd edition was when we finally in the game got the idea of you can cast cantrips as many times as you want. I let people do that in 2nd edition. Now, in 2nd edition, cantrips were, for the most part, useless, which is nice. In like 5th edition, you can cast cantrips as much as you want, and you can actually have attack cantrips that are actually useful throughout your character's career. It wasn't like that in 2nd edition. Cantrips were, for the most part, pretty useless, so it didn't really break the game. But I had countless house rules like that. I remember, I'd get a new player who's pretty well versed in the game. I'd have to give them like a handout of all my house rules. These are all the things that work differently in my game. And I carried that through to 3rd edition. And I think about the time of 3.5, I started realizing that the 3.5 system was pretty well designed. And maybe I was wrong. I was a lot younger then, a lot less experienced then as a GM. But I thought at the time that 2nd edition had a lot of problems. And I was making house rules to, quote, fix 2nd edition. With 3.5, I felt like it didn't really need fixed so much. And I felt like the system was such a well-oiled machine that I didn't want to tinker too much with things I didn't fully understand. So I kind of backed off from the house ruling in 3.5. When I ran Pathfinder, I mean, that system is just so bloated and overcomplicated that I wasn't even going to try to house rule stuff in that. And then by the time we got to 5th edition, I had my current philosophy now, which is I'm really going to learn a system and know it inside and out before I start fiddling with it and making changes and making house rules. And by the time I got to that point with 5th edition, I felt like, most of the rules that are there, I'm happy with and I think work really well. And, this potion thing was the one possible exception. But again, until today, I thought it might at least be rules as written, if not rules as intended. But turns out it's totally a house rule. And now after giving it more thought, I think it's probably an unwise house rule and probably a house rule I'm going to cease using now because I think it can and eventually will be abused. So better to nip it in the bud now when players don't even use it anyway and just get rid of it before players figure out how powerful it is and start using it all the time. And then I have to take their favorite toy away. So that's kind of, where I stand on house rules and why I feel the way I do. With 5th edition, like I said, for the most part, I haven't really encountered a rule that I don't think works or that I don't like or that I feel like I need to change. With 5th edition, it's not so much house ruling as homebrewing. I just want more of a lot of stuff. I want more domains for clerics. I want more spells for everybody. I want more monsters. I want more of this and more of that. more backgrounds, so it's more coming up with new things than it is changing what's already in the game. And that's just kind of where I'm at and how I got to where I'm at and why I look at it this way. And, I've noticed that it seems like to me, the more experienced GMs get, the less they house rule. And it tends to be the newer and less experienced GMs that are making house rules all over the place. And I think, a lot of us, as we have more and more experience, we learn probably the hard way, a lot of us, why that can be unwise. And we also, I think we just learn to understand the systems better. And I think a lot of times, as newer GMs, we're arrogant. And in our arrogance, we think that even though we've just started running this game, we're somehow as smart and as knowledgeable as the people who design it, and that we can outthink them and come up with better rules than what they did. And it's only with experience and seeing some of these house rules blow up in your face that you come to respect your elders and understand that these designers actually do know what they are talking about. They are professionals. And especially with D&D 5th edition, I mean, they play tested the shit out of this game, and even the best of us that run the most and have the most players are never going to be able to play test the way Wizards was able to play test. So, I think that with age and experience comes wisdom, and we learn to more accept that things work and be sure that we really understand what's going on and how all the moving pieces interact before we start monkeying around with stuff. So, if you're not there yet, maybe just take my word for it and maybe, cool it a little bit with the house ruling. Wait till you have that mastery of the system first. But, it also depends. I'm looking from a point of view of a GM running long running campaigns, where if I make a house rule today, I'm going to have to deal with that house rule 6 months from now. If you're running one shots or you're running short little arcs, it can be different because, every month or so you're starting something new and you can redo the house rules if you want. So if you're in a situation like that, you can experiment more. And I've actually done quite a bit of experimenting with 5th edition, where I have, shorter campaigns or one shots or whatever. And I'll be like, oh, for this time, I'm going to try this. Like one of the campaigns I ran, I tried giving everybody an extra feat at first level just to see how that would go. And turns out I didn't like it, and I don't do that anymore. But I tried it, just to see how it went. And there's been other things like that I've tried. Right now I have my guild cloaks, which is a magic item for Primordia, and think they might be a little too powerful. So I've got a one shot I was running, and so I gave them the cloaks just to see, are they too powerful or not? Jury's still out on that. I'm not sure. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, I like to test and experiment with things. But if I'm running a campaign and I'm like, this campaign, we're going to go to 20th level or whatever, then, that's not when I'm going to do experiments like this. Because if I put in a house rule now and it becomes a problem, then we either have to deal with that later and get rid of the house rule, and maybe we have to retcon something, or it becomes a huge pain in the ass, or we've got to live with this broken house rule until the campaign's over, which could be months or years. And we don't want to do that. So, like everything, it depends where you're at, depends what you're doing. If you're doing more shorter length stuff, then, you can feel more free to experiment. But especially if you're running more long-term campaigns, especially in like your own homebrew world, just be careful with the house ruling. Measure twice, cut once. All right. Well, that is going to wrap up episode 134 of Game Master's Journey. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed our discussions. And if you're looking for more information on any of these topics that I've hit on today, or you'd like to give some feedback or weigh in on topics for future shows, definitely check out our community. You can find links to the community in the show notes. You can find links to my YouTube channel, all kinds of stuff in the show notes. It's all there at starwalkerstudios.com. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you. I hear from new listeners every week, and I hear from listeners who've been with the show for a while, but I just haven't heard from before. almost every week too, which is awesome. It's always great to interact with new listeners. So let me hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas. So I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then,
this has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.